Think you know the whole story? Turns out you were probably taught the half-truth. Welcome to Half-Truths. Close your eyes. Picture a medieval dungeon. What do you see? Cold, damp stone, dripping water, chains hanging from the walls, maybe a rack in the corner, and in the center, looming in the torchlight, is the showpiece. It's a sarcophagus, but it's not made of stone. It's made of black iron, cold and imposing. It's shaped like a person, maybe a serene woman, maybe a stern-faced monk. But the serenity is a lie. A heavy creaking hinge swings open and you see the inside. It's lined with spikes, long, rusted iron spikes, positioned with gruesome precision, not just to pierce, but to wound, to avoid the vital organs, to prolong the agony. The doors close slowly, a symphony of grinding metal, and the spikes slide into flesh. The screams are muffled by the thick iron. This is the Iron Maiden. It is the single most terrifying, iconic, and unforgettable symbol of medieval cruelty. It's the Dark Ages, summed up in one diabolical invention. We've all seen it. In movies, in cartoons. I'm pretty sure Scooby-Doo ran from one. In video games, in history textbooks, in museums. It is a solid, unshakable fact of history. A testament to the barbarism of the past, and a comforting reminder of our own enlightened, civilized present. It is, without a doubt, the perfect instrument of medieval torture. But what if that story isn't the whole story? What if I told you that the Iron Maiden, that perfect symbol of the Middle Ages, has one tiny, insignificant problem? It isn't medieval. Welcome to Half-Truths, the show where we unlearn the facts we thought we knew. Today, we are prying open the most famous torture device in history. We're going to find out where it really came from, who built it, and why. And we're going to discover that the truth about the Iron Maiden isn't about medieval cruelty at all. It's about 19th century showmanship, our fascination with the macabre, and our deep, abiding need to invent monsters to make ourselves feel safe. So let's talk about the story we all know. The myth of the Iron Maiden is simple, brutal, and compelling. The device, we're told, was a favorite of the Inquisition, or perhaps of impossibly cruel feudal lords. A heretic, a blasphemer, a political rival, or just a poor peasant who looked at the Baron the wrong way would be arrested. After a sham trial, or perhaps no trial at all, they would be brought to the dungeon. They'd be shown the device. Maybe they'd be given one last chance to confess. And then they'd be forced inside. The heavy doors would be swung shut by muscular executioners, and the spikes would begin their work. A spike for the eyes, spikes for the chest, the arms, the legs. The victim wouldn't die quickly. That was the whole point. They would bleed out, slowly, over hours, perhaps days, trapped in a lightless, agonizing, upright coffin. The final, terrible detail we're often told is that two of the spikes were positioned precisely to pierce the eyes, a final, poetic cruelty. It's a story that sticks with you. And it's a story that fits perfectly with our popular conception of the Dark Ages. We have this cultural shorthand for the medieval period. We imagine it as 1,000 years of uninterrupted misery, superstition, and violence, wedged between the clean, marble-columned glory of Rome and the bright, artistic rebirth of the Renaissance. In this story, the Dark Ages are a time of ignorance, where science was heresy, where everyone was a mud-covered peasant, and where life was, in the famous words of Thomas Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short. And in this world of violent superstition, what could be more fitting than a machine designed for no other purpose than pure, sadistic agony? The Iron Maiden is the mascot for this entire idea. It's not a tool with a dual purpose. A sword can be for justice or murder. A rack can, in the twisted logic of the time, be for extracting a truthful confession. But the Iron Maiden, it's just for pain. It is cruelty for cruelty's sake. It represents the arbitrary, terrifying power of the church and the state in an age before reason. And we've seen them. People will tell you, I saw one in a museum. I visited a castle in Germany or Italy, and it was right there in the dungeon. The most famous one, the one that started it all, was the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg. It was the star attraction of the city's castle dungeon, seen by thousands of tourists. It was a terrifying, anthropomorphic iron box, and its existence proved the stories were true. It stood there as silent, ironclad testimony to the horrors of the past. It's such a complete, perfect story. It feels true. It feels right. And that's usually our first clue here on Half-Truths. When a story is too perfect, too neat, too perfectly aligned with our expectations, it's time to start pulling on the thread. So let's start pulling. The first thread is a simple one. If this was a common or even an uncommon device used in the Middle Ages, a period that, let's remember, spans 1,000 years, from about 500 to 1500 AD, where are the records? This was a literate period, especially in the later Middle Ages. We have meticulous court documents. We have city chronicles. We have executioners' diaries detailing their grisly work. We have letters, journals, and trial transcripts from the Inquisition itself. These documents are shockingly detailed. They list expenses for firewood for burnings, the price of rope for hangings, and the specific procedures for judicial torture. They mention the rack. They mention the strappado, where a victim's arms are tied behind their back and they are hoisted into the air and dropped. They mention thumbscrews and the boot for crushing feet. It's all horrifying. It's all there in the historical record. But guess what isn't? Not one single solitary mention of an Iron Maiden. Nothing. Zero zip. No court in Germany, no inquisitor in Spain, no feudal lord in France ever wrote, "Today we sentenced Hans the heretic to the maiden." No chronicler ever described one in use. For 1,000 years, the most iconic torture device of the era somehow managed to avoid being written about ever by anyone. That's not just a red flag. That's a whole parade of red flags. So, if it's not in the medieval record, where did it come from? When does this iconic device first make an appearance? For that, we have to leap forward, way forward, past the Renaissance, past the Reformation, past Shakespeare, and all the way to the end of the 18th century. The year is 1793. A German philosopher and historian named Johann Philipp Siebenkees is writing a travel guide to the city of Nuremberg. Nuremberg loves its medieval history. It's a big part of the city's identity. Siebenkees, digging through the archives, claims to have found a reference in an old city chronicle from 1515. According to his story, a coin forger was executed in that year in a most terrible fashion. He was, Siebenkees wrote, placed inside a closet or casket lined with sharp iron points. The doors were slowly closed, so that the irons, pointed like daggers, pierced his arms and his legs in several places, and his breast, and his belly, and his head. And he was 2 days in it, thus breaking on the wheel, and died. This sounds like it. This is the smoking gun, or is it? Historians who went back to check Siebenkees' work found problems. The original 1515 chronicle he supposedly cited, no one is quite sure it ever existed. But even giving him the benefit of the doubt, let's look at what did exist in Germany at that time. There was a device used for public humiliation, not torture or execution. It was called a Schandmantel in German, which translates to a coat of shame or cask of shame. It was a barrel, sometimes made of wood, sometimes sheet metal, that a person was forced to wear in public. It was heavy, uncomfortable, and deeply humiliating. It was a form of social punishment. Some versions of these Schandmantels were built in a human form, and some, on the inside, might have had dull, harmless nubs or protrusions, just to make them extra uncomfortable. They were not, however, spiked killing machines. What historians now believe is that Siebenkees, writing in 1793, either found a vague reference to one of these devices or to a story of a different execution and let his imagination run wild. And you have to understand the time he was writing in. This was the peak of the Gothic horror craze. People were devouring novels about haunted castles, dark family secrets, and yes, medieval monks committing unspeakable cruelties in torchlit dungeons. The Dark Ages were being actively rebranded as a time of delicious, romantic terror. Siebenkees' story of the spiked casket was a smash hit. It was exactly what people wanted to hear. It confirmed all their darkest, most titillating fantasies about the medieval past. And then, a funny thing happened. A few decades after Siebenkees published his story, in the early 1800s, an actual object appeared in Nuremberg, the very city Siebenkees had written about. It was called the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg. It was exactly as he had described, a tall, iron sarcophagus, human-shaped, with a serene face on the outside and a terrifying, spiked interior. It was put on display in the Nuremberg castle. Tourists flocked to see it. It was the physical proof that Siebenkees' story was true. But it wasn't proof, it was a prop. It was almost certainly built in the 19th century, based on Siebenkees' 18th century description. It was a brilliant piece of showmanship, a macabre tourist trap. It was what we call a pastiche. It was likely assembled from various bits and pieces. The outer shell might have been an actual 16th or 17th century cask of shame, and some enterprising, morbidly inclined collector or curator simply added the scary face and, crucially, the spikes. This original Nuremberg Maiden, the prototype for all the others, was a 19th century fabrication, built to satisfy a 19th century obsession, based on an 18th century discovery that was, at best, a wild exaggeration. And once the Nuremberg Maiden existed, the myth became unstoppable. Other collectors and museum curators, seeing the success of the Nuremberg attraction, wanted their own. A market was born. Other maidens began popping up. The Maiden of Florence is another famous one. It, too, has been thoroughly debunked as a 19th century creation. The Iron Maiden of Vesta Coburg was a similar story. Even the famous Castle of the Counts in Ghent, Belgium, has a torture museum full of terrifying implements. For years, it displayed an Iron Maiden, but the museum's own curators are now clear. Almost everything in that room, including the Maiden, is a 19th century theatrical prop designed to create a gruesome atmosphere for visitors. The entire time, we weren't looking at medieval history. We were looking at 19th century Gothic horror, passed off as fact. We were looking at the Victorian equivalent of a haunted house attraction. The final ironic twist to the story of the original Nuremberg Maiden, it was destroyed, not by a medieval army, but by an Allied bombing raid in 1945. The ultimate historical fake was, in the end, obliterated by a very real event of 20th century history. So, this brings us to the real story. If the Iron Maiden is a fake, what does that mean? Does it mean the Middle Ages were actually a wonderful, gentle time? Absolutely not. This is the crucial part of any half-truth. Debunking one myth doesn't mean we should invent an equally false one in the opposite direction. The medieval and early modern periods were, by our standards, incredibly brutal. Horrific things were done to the human body in the name of justice and religion. As we said, the rack, the strappado, burning at the stake, breaking on the wheel, these were all terrifyingly real. Judicial torture was used to extract confessions, based on the twisted legal theory that a person wouldn't confess to a capital crime even under duress if they were innocent. But there is a profound difference between the real torture of the Middle Ages and the myth of the Iron Maiden. The real, documented methods of torture were, in their own terrible way, bureaucratic. They were part of a legal process. They had rules. A confession extracted by torture had to be repeated freely the next day, a horrifying distinction, but a legal one. The goal, in theory, was not the pain itself, but the confession. The execution that followed was a separate, public, and often ritualized event. The Iron Maiden is something else entirely. It's not a tool for extracting information. It's a machine for killing, slowly, sadistically. In private, it combines torture and execution into one device for no purpose other than to inflict the maximum amount of suffering. This specific kind of horror, the elaborate, mechanical, personalized, almost artistic sadism, is not a medieval sensibility. It is a modern one. It's the sensibility of the Gothic novel. It's the sensibility of Edgar Allan Poe, who, let's not forget, also invented a famous medieval torture device in his story, The Pit and the Pendulum. The giant, swinging, scythe-like pendulum, the hot, closing walls, also 19th century fictions. The 19th century was obsessed with this idea. The Industrial Revolution was building incredible new machines. At the same time, the Romantic movement was looking back at the past, painting it as a time of high emotion, dark superstition, and wild passions. The Iron Maiden is the love child of those two obsessions. It is an industrial machine for Gothic horror. So why did this particular myth stick so hard? Why, even after being debunked for decades, is the Iron Maiden still the first thing we think of? Because it serves a purpose. It's not a medieval artifact, it's a cultural artifact. It tells us a story we want to believe. First, it's the ultimate propaganda. In the 19th century, as stories of the Maiden spread, they were a fantastic tool for anti-Catholic sentiment. It was the perfect symbol for Protestant enlightenment versus Catholic superstition and the barbarism of the Inquisition. It didn't matter that the Inquisition never used one. It looked like something they would use. Second, it's a story of progress. The Iron Maiden is a powerful tool for patting ourselves on the back. We look at this thing, this symbol of ultimate barbarism, and we can say, look how far we've come. Look how civilized, how rational, how good we are now. It draws a thick, black line between them, the superstitious, brutal past, and us, the enlightened, modern present. It's comforting. And third, let's be honest. It's just a great story. It's gruesome, it's visual, it's terrifying. It's a monster, and human beings have always loved monster stories. So here we are. We started with a solid, ironclad fact of medieval history, a symbol of an entire era. And as we pulled on the thread, it just dissolved. It evaporated into a cloud of 18th century rumor, 19th century showmanship, and our own modern-day assumptions. The Iron Maiden in that museum isn't a window into the medieval soul. It's a mirror. It reflects our fears. It reflects our imagination. And it reflects our need to simplify the past into a good versus evil caricature, with us as the good guys. Correcting this half-truth matters. It's not just about being a nitpicker. It's about realizing that the past is not a theme park. It's not a haunted house populated by oni-dimensional monsters. The Dark Ages were not 1,000 years of darkness. They were 1,000 years of humanity. Complex, contradictory, brilliant, flawed, and yes, sometimes brutal, but brutal in their own way, not in the ways we invent for them. The Iron Maiden is empty. It never held a medieval victim, but it is full of our own stories, our own propaganda, and our own prejudices. And that, in the end, is a far more useful and interesting truth than the myth of the spikes. The most terrifying thing we can find in that dark iron coffin isn't a medieval skeleton. It's our own reflection. Now you know the real story. What other half-truths are still out there? If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us next time. Until then, stay curious.